There are places in this world where silence becomes almost tangible. Places where every breath is a conquest, where the thin air sets the lungs on fire, and where the eternal snow whispers secrets few have dared to hear. Among the highest mountains on the planet, in the heart of the Himalayas, lies a presence that defies our understanding of the possible. Imagine for a moment being over 5,000 meters above sea level. The air contains half the oxygen of sea level. Every step is a monumental effort. The cold is so intense it can kill in minutes. The wind cuts through your skin like blades of ice. It's a world where human life simply shouldn't be possible. And yet, they say someone walks there. Someone who has made this frozen hell their home. Their footsteps leave enormous marks in the virgin snow. Marks that defy any logical explanation. Footprints measuring over a foot long, imprinted with a force that suggests immense weight. Marks that soon disappear with the next snowfall, as if the mountain itself conspired to keep its secret hidden in the heights where only gods should dwell. No one can capture it. Few swear to have seen it, but its presence has echoed for centuries in the voices of the people who call these impossible heights home. Voices that speak with reverence, never fear. Voices that tell stories passed down from generation to generation, like embers keeping an ancient flame alive. He is the Yeti, the legendary snowman of the Himalayas. Hello, I'm Kaya the Legend Teller, and today I'm going to take you on a journey through the world's oldest traditions, where reality and myth intertwine like the icy winds of sacred mountains. Together, we'll discover not only what the Yeti is, but also why it lives on in the souls of the Himalayan people and in the imaginations of explorers around the world. This isn't a horror story. This is a story of mystery, of tradition, of the encounter between cultures, of scientific pursuit, and of something much deeper, the human capacity to believe in the impossible and find in that belief a transformative force. Long before the first Westerners set foot on the snow-capped slopes of Everest, long before modern expeditions equipped with GPS and satellite communications, long before cameras and scientific equipment, stories existed. Stories as ancient as the mountains themselves. In the isolated villages of Nepal and Tibet, these tales circulated like the smoke from yak dung-fueled stoves, warming the freezing nights with tales that made hearts beat faster and eyes sparkle in the light of the dancing flames. These were stories told by elders who had heard them from their own grandparents in an unbroken chain of oral tradition, lost in the mists of time. For these people, the Yeti was never just a creature of flesh and blood roaming the mountains. He was something much deeper, much more significant. He was a spiritual guardian of the mountains, a protector of the eternal glaciers, a sacred force that guarded secrets that no human should ever violate. He was the embodiment of the very spirit of the heights, a presence that commanded absolute respect. To truly understand what the Yeti represents, we need to delve into the communities that first spoke of him. Imagine small villages, some with only a few dozen families, nestled in glacial valleys where winter can last 8 months. Communities isolated by storms that can last weeks, where survival depends on ancestral knowledge of how to read nature's signs. In these villages, every child grew up hearing about the mountain's most mysterious inhabitant, not as a monster to be feared, but as a presence to be revered. Mothers told these stories while knitting with yak wool. Fathers repeated them while repairing climbing gear. Grandparents whispered them by the fire as the wind howled outside. The name itself carries deep layers of meaning. In Tibetan, Yeti is a combination of two words, Ya, meaning rock, and Te, meaning animal. But it wasn't just any animal. It was the sacred rock animal, the one that belonged to the mountains as the mountains belonged to the gods. It was a creature that had chosen to live where only the most powerful spirits could survive. In Nepal, the locals called him Metoh, a phrase that translates as bear man. But this translation fails to capture the complexity of the concept. To them, he was neither fully human nor fully bear. He was something unique, an impossible synthesis of humanity and savagery, of intelligence and instinct, of civilization and primordial nature. There were other names as well, each revealing a different aspect of the creature. Zu-te referred to the great, the powerful. Mih-te spoke of the man-thing, something that transcended the usual categories. Kangmi meant snowman, but with a connotation of purity, of something that had been purified by the eternal snows until it reached a higher state of existence. For centuries, these stories remained within Himalayan communities as carefully guarded treasures. They weren't legends for entertainment. They were spiritual teachings, ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the wildest forces of nature. Tibetan monks spoke of the Yeti in their teachings, not as a folkloric fantasy, but as a profound spiritual truth. For them, it represented the possibility of existing in total harmony with Earth's most hostile environment. It was living proof that enlightenment could be found not only in the silent meditation of monasteries, but also in direct communion with the most extreme forces of creation. In the frozen monasteries, where the wind howls through the endless nights and the monks spend hours in silent meditation, stories were told of footprints found near the most sacred places. Footprints that always appeared in places no human being should be able to reach without modern equipment. As if the Yeti were an eternal pilgrim, visiting the points where earth meets sky, where the physical meets the spiritual. The Sherpa hunters and guides also had their own stories, narratives forged from direct experience on the world's most dangerous mountains. These were men who knew every rock, every trail, every shadow on Everest's slopes. Men whose lives depended on their ability to read nature's subtlest signs, to anticipate changes in the weather, to find safe paths where others saw only rocky chaos. They spoke of brief encounters, always distant, always fleeting. A huge silhouette moving against the snow, disappearing before the eye could be sure of what it truly saw. Fresh footprints found in places where they themselves had passed hours before, with no sign of life. Strange sounds echoing through the rocky valleys during the darkest nights, sounds that corresponded to no known animal. But most important was what these encounters provoked in them. It wasn't fear that permeated these narratives. It was a peculiar kind of respect. The respect one has for something that chose the most extreme solitude on the planet and still managed not only to survive, but to thrive magnificently. Imagine the courage, or perhaps the wisdom required to make the deadliest altitudes on Earth your permanent home, where the air is so thin that every movement becomes a conscious effort, where the temperature can plummet to 40 degrees below zero without warning, where there is no natural shelter, no obvious food source, no companionship of any kind, where the loneliness is so complete it can break the human mind in a matter of days. The Yeti, according to the traditions of the mountain peoples, had not only chosen this impossible environment, but had flourished in it. He had found a way of existing that transcended the limitations we consider absolute for any life form. This resonated deeply in the souls of the people who lived on the edges of this extreme world. They intuitively understood that there is a special power in those who can find fulfillment in the most radical solitude. The Yeti wasn't isolated out of rejection of the civilized world. He was isolated because he had discovered in extreme isolation a form of communion with something far greater than any human companionship could offer. Traditions held that he appeared especially during the most violent storms, when winds reached speeds that could knock down adult yaks, when snow fell so thick it turned midday into pitch black night, when even the most experienced mountaineers took shelter and waited out the storm. It was precisely at these times that some reported his presence, as if he were made of the storm itself, a living extension of the mountain's fury and wild beauty. as if he not only tolerated the most extreme conditions, but celebrated them, danced with them, found in them a form of ecstasy that ordinary humans could never comprehend. Everything changed dramatically when the outside world discovered these ancient stories. The year was 1921, and a new era of exploration was beginning. The world's great powers were setting their sights on the planet's last uncharted territories, and the Himalayas represented the ultimate challenge to the adventurous spirit of the time. Charles Howard Berry was the kind of man the Victorian era produced. A British Army colonel, a born explorer, endowed with an insatiable scientific curiosity and the steely determination needed to lead one of the first major Western expeditions to Mount Everest. He commanded a team of experienced mountaineers, all equipped with the most modern climbing equipment of the time. They were scouting for future attempts to conquer the world's highest peak, mapping routes, studying climatic conditions, and testing the limits of human endurance at altitudes few humans had ever experienced. They were literally treading where almost no Westerner had gone before. It was during one of these reconnaissance trips, at an altitude of approximately 20,000 feet, that Howard Berry and his team saw something that would forever change how the Western world viewed the Himalayan mountains. There, imprinted in the fresh snow on a slope they had planned to explore, were footprints. But these were no ordinary footprints. They were enormous, over a foot long and nearly 8 inches wide. They were humanoid in their basic form, but clearly non-human in their proportions. They were perfectly defined in the snow, as if they had been left by someone who had passed by only a few hours earlier. The most disturbing thing was the location. The footprints were at an altitude where the air contained less than half the oxygen available at sea level, in a region where nighttime temperatures could kill an unprotected human in less than an hour, on a steep slope where even experienced climbers would struggle to maintain their footing. Howard Berry, being the meticulous man that he was, recorded everything in his journals. He measured the footprints, noted their exact location, and described the weather conditions. But when he asked his Sherpa guides about those mysterious marks in the snow, their response was filled with a reverence he could feel, even without fully understanding their origin. Metoh-kangmi, the Sherpas said, their voices carrying a weight that made the thin air seem even denser. It was an expression Howard Berry had never heard before, but one the guides pronounced with the kind of respect reserved only for the sacred. The Sherpas explained with the patience of those sharing ancient knowledge with a well-meaning but ignorant stranger that these were the footprints of the guardian of the heights, the being who walked where not even they, with all their mountain experience, dared to tread, a presence that inhabited regions where only the most powerful spirits could exist. Howard Berry faithfully recorded these explanations in his journals, fascinated by the cultural complexity he was uncovering. But when his expedition returned to civilization and his findings reached the Western press, something fundamental was lost in the cultural translation. The transformation of the Yeti story when it reached the Western press is a fascinating example of how different cultures can interpret the same phenomenon in completely opposite ways. Metoh-kangmi, the reverential expression used by the Sherpas, was translated by British journalists as the abominable snowman. This translation completely changed the meaning and tone of the story. What was meant by spiritual reverence became sensationalist revulsion. What was meant by ancestral respect became fear and morbid curiosity. What was once a sacred tradition became fodder for newspaper headlines seeking to sell more copies. But there was something almost poetic about this cultural distortion. It was as if the Yeti itself was protecting itself, allowing the world to see it only as a distorted version of its true nature. The West, with its compulsive need to categorize, dominate, and exploit, had transformed a spiritual guardian into a creature to be hunted. From that historic moment on, a fundamental shift occurred in the way the Yeti was perceived. Expeditions began arriving in the Himalayas, no longer just to conquer mountains or conduct geographical mapping, but specifically to find and, if possible, capture the abominable snowman. Men arrived equipped with cameras, sophisticated traps, and even weapons. They were explorers who didn't understand that perhaps they were hunting something that existed precisely because it had chosen to remain beyond the reach of any form of hunting or capture. Something that had found its own essence and purpose in inaccessibility. During the 1920s and 1930s, reports began to multiply exponentially. Experienced mountaineers, men whose professional credibility was unquestionable, began reporting sightings, always fleeting, always distant, always leaving more questions than answers, but too consistent to be easily dismissed. Alexander Kellas, a pioneer of altitude medicine, reported seeing gigantic footprints during his expeditions to study the effects of extreme altitude on the human body. Eni Tombazi, a photographer for the Royal Geographical Society, swore he saw a dark bipedal figure moving against the snow at a distance of approximately 300 meters. Each report was carefully documented, but also carefully questioned. The scientific community at the time was divided between skeptics who attributed the sightings to bears, mirages, or hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen, and those who remained open-minded to the possibility of discovering a new species. What all these early Western explorers shared was a common experience. Something about the search for the Yeti transformed them. They arrived as conquerors determined to unravel a mystery, but often returned as changed men, with a different understanding of their own relationship to nature and the unknown. Many described a sense of humility they had never experienced before. The immensity of the mountains, combined with the possibility that there was something within them that remained beyond their comprehension, made them question their own place in the universe. The moment that would forever define the modern legend of the Yeti came in 1951, when Eric Shipton, one of the most respected and experienced mountaineers of his generation, was returning from a reconnaissance expedition to Everest, accompanied by Michael Ward, a young doctor and talented mountaineer. Shipton was known for his meticulous and scientific approach. He was not a man given to fantasies or exaggerations. His reputation had been built on decades of careful exploration and accurate reporting. When Eric Shipton said he had seen something, the international mountaineering community paid attention. They were descending from an altitude of approximately 6,000 meters when something brought them to an abrupt halt. There, in the pristine snow of a remote glacier, lay a footprint that defied conventional explanation. But it wasn't just an isolated footprint. It was a clear sequence, showing a walking pattern that extended for several meters. The individual footprint was extraordinary. It measured about 13 inches long by 8 inches wide. It was deeply imprinted in the firm snow, indicating considerable weight. The details were sharp enough to reveal what appeared to be individual fingers, with what could be interpreted as a prominent big toe. Shipton, being the scientifically minded man that he was, immediately recognized the historical significance of the moment. He placed his own boot next to the footprint to provide scale and carefully photographed it using a Kodak camera. This single photograph would become one of the most famous and debated images in the history of cryptozoology. The footprint's location was as significant as its shape. It was at an altitude where the air contains roughly half the oxygen available at sea level, at a temperature that could easily kill an unprotected human, and in a region so remote that even experienced Sherpas rarely ventured there. Michael Ward described his initial reaction. It was as if we were faced with proof that there are still mysteries on Earth that our science cannot explain. He reported a feeling of being in the presence of something that transcended normal categories of understanding. Shipton wrote in his diary, "The footprint was fresh, possibly made the day before. It was perfectly preserved by the low temperature. We could not imagine what animal could have left it at such an altitude and in such conditions. When they returned to civilization and the photograph was developed, it literally spread around the world. Newspapers from London to New York splashed the image on the front page. Scientific journals devoted entire articles to analyzing the footprint. For the first time in history, the world had something tangible, something that could be seen, measured, analyzed, and debated. The photographs sparked intense debate in the international scientific community. Skeptics immediately came up with alternative explanations. Some claimed it could be a bare footprint, deformed by the natural process of snow melting and refreezing. Others suggested it could be a human footprint enlarged by the same melting process. But there were features of the footprint that defied these simple explanations. The sharpness of the details was inconsistent with significant melting. The depth of the impression suggested a weight much greater than that of a typical bear in the region. The overall pattern of the shape was distinctly different from both human tracks and known bear tracks. Shipton's photographs sparked a new era in the search for the Yeti. From 1951 onward, serious scientific expeditions began to be organized specifically to investigate the phenomenon. It was no longer just curious adventurers or mountaineers who occasionally reported sightings. Renowned zoologists, respected anthropologists, and experienced mountaineers joined forces in a quest that blended scientific rigor with genuine adventure. In 1954, London's Daily Mail organized one of the first expeditions dedicated entirely to searching for the Yeti. It was an impressive operation for the time. A team of 7 experts, including zoologists, experienced mountaineers, and a newspaper correspondent, equipped with advanced photographic equipment, radio communication systems, and supplies for months of exploration. The expedition spent 5 months in the most remote regions of the Himalayas. They found multiple footprints, collected hair samples found on rocks and branches, and recorded strange sounds echoing through the valleys at night. But like so many other expeditions that would follow, they returned with intriguing but inconclusive evidence. What most fascinated the expedition members wasn't necessarily the physical evidence they collected, but the personal transformation they experienced during the months of searching. Daily Mail correspondent Ralph Izzard wrote, "After weeks at these extreme altitudes, searching for something that may or may not exist, you begin to question the boundaries between the real and the possible. The mountain changes you in ways you didn't expect." Sir Edmund Hillary, the man who had conquered Everest just a few years earlier, decided to lead his own scientific expedition in 1960. Hillary was known worldwide for his practical and skeptical nature. When someone with his credibility and experience decided to dedicate significant time and resources to investigating the Yeti, the scientific world paid serious attention. Hillary's expedition was meticulously planned and executed. They established advanced bases at multiple altitudes and used state-of-the-art scientific equipment for the time, including 16mm cameras and sound recording equipment. They spent months systematically traversing the regions where sightings had been reported. During this expedition, Hillary and his team were able to directly examine some of the most famous Yeti-related artifacts. At Kumjung Monastery, monks had preserved for generations what they claimed was a Yeti scalp. It was a sacred artifact, revered by the monks and the local community as a relic of immense spiritual value. When they finally got permission to scientifically examine the artifact, they discovered it was made from the skin of a siro, a species of goat antelope native to the Himalayan region. To many, this seemed to definitively discredit at least part of the Yeti lore, but the monks' reaction to the discovery was profoundly revealing. They weren't disappointed or defensive about the scientific results. The monastery's head lama explained to Hillary, "The spiritual value of this object doesn't depend on its biological origin. The Yeti exists in many forms. This is just one of them." This perspective began to influence some of the Western researchers involved in the expedition. they began to question whether they were approaching the Yeti phenomenon correctly. Perhaps it wasn't something meant to be captured, catalogued, and displayed in a museum display case. The 1970s and 1980s brought significant technological advances that promised to definitively solve the Yeti mystery. Expeditions began using more sophisticated cameras, 16mm film equipment, heat-activated motion detectors, and even the first satellite tracking systems to map the most remote regions of the Himalayas with unprecedented precision. One of the most intriguing and well-documented discoveries from this period came from a Japanese expedition led by Dr. Yoshiteru Takahashi in 1985. They found a sequence of footprints stretching nearly a kilometer on a remote glacier on the Tibetan side of Everest. The tracks were remarkably consistent, showing a walking pattern that suggested a large biped moving with purpose through extremely difficult terrain. What most impressed the Japanese researchers was the route the footprints followed. They led to the most technically challenging parts of the glacier, precisely avoiding deadly crevasses in the ice that even experienced mountaineers with modern equipment would struggle to detect. It was as if whoever had made those footprints possessed an intimate, intuitive knowledge of glacial geography that surpassed decades of human experience. Dr. Takahashi wrote in his report, "The route followed by the footprints demonstrates a knowledge of the mountain that could only come from decades or perhaps centuries of direct experience. Whoever made these footprints knows these mountains in a way that we, with all our maps and equipment, can never match." During this same period, a fascinating phenomenon began to emerge, one that anthropologists and psychologists began to study with increasing interest. Tourists and climbers who spent weeks or months in the mountains searching for the Yeti often returned transformed in ways that went far beyond what was expected for a simple mountaineering expedition. Many described an experience of connection with solitude they had never imagined possible. "You spend weeks walking in that vastness," reported James McKinley, an American mountaineer who participated in 3 Yeti search expeditions. "And gradually you realize that there is a fundamental difference between being alone by circumstance and choosing to be alone. Loneliness at extreme altitudes is not empty. It is filled with something I cannot name, but which I can feel with every cell in my body." Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who studied more than 50 people who had participated in extended Yeti search expeditions, discovered interesting patterns. There is a documentable neurological transformation that occurs when humans spend extended periods in extreme isolation combined with altitudes that challenge our physiology. Areas of the brain related to the individual's sense of self become less active, while areas related to the perception of connection with the environment become dramatically more active. This transformation became almost as common and predictable as the occasional footprint. People who arrived in the Himalayas as staunch skeptics often returned as something completely different. Not necessarily believers in the physical existence of the Yeti, but deeply convinced that there was something in the mountains that defied conventional explanation and had changed them in permanent ways. Anthropologists began studying this phenomenon by comparing it to traditional spiritual practices of cultures living in extreme geographic isolation. They discovered that societies that evolved in environments of extreme isolation consistently develop a unique understanding of solitude as a pathway to expanded states of consciousness. For the indigenous peoples of the Himalayas, this understanding was as natural as breathing. Being alone at extreme altitudes was not a condition of suffering to be endured, but an opportunity to commune with forces that transcended ordinary human experience. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought the most powerful technology humanity had ever developed for solving biological mysteries: DNA analysis. Finally, it seemed the Yeti mystery could be definitively solved through genetic analysis of samples collected over decades of expeditions. In 2008, a joint expedition of American and European universities managed to collect hair samples found in a remote Himalayan cave at an altitude of over 5,500 meters. The hairs were visibly different from anything researchers had previously catalogued. Thicker than human hair, finer than bear hair, with a unique microscopic structure that matched no known species in the region. Initial DNA analysis revealed something that perplexed the scientific community. The genetic material didn't completely match any species catalogued in global genetic databases, but it showed striking similarities to Himalayan bears, which appeared to have evolved in complete genetic isolation for thousands of years. It was as if the mountain itself was functioning as a natural laboratory, creating its own unique versions of life. Dr. Brian Sykes, a geneticist at the University of Oxford and one of the world's leading authorities on ancient DNA analysis, decided to conduct the most comprehensive study ever undertaken on Yeti evidence. Between 2012 and 2017, he and his team analyzed more than 30 different samples of material believed to belong to the Yeti, collected over several decades from various locations in the Himalayas. The results were both enlightening and deeply mysterious. The vast majority of samples turned out to belong to known species: Asiatic black bears, Himalayan brown bears, even domestic dogs and horses. To skeptics, this seemed to definitively confirm that the Yeti was simply a misidentification of known animals. But some samples continued to defy explanation. The DNA showed characteristics that didn't fit neatly into any known category. There were genetic sequences that suggested an evolutionary lineage that had split from other bears tens of thousands of years ago, evolving in complete isolation at the planet's most extreme altitudes. Dr. Sykes explained, "What we have found is evidence that the Himalayas harbor populations of animals that have evolved completely independently over extraordinarily long periods. This does not prove the existence of the Yeti as traditionally imagined, but it does suggest that these mountains still hold biological secrets that our science has only just begun to understand." The local community's reaction to these scientific discoveries revealed a fundamental difference in perspective. Far from being disappointed to learn that much of the physical evidence of the Yeti was actually bears, they greeted the results with a kind of calm satisfaction. Pemba Sherpa, one of the most respected guides in the Everest region, explained to a team of researchers, "You keep looking for the Yeti with your microscopes and machines, but the Yeti is not in the microscope. He is in the experience of walking alone where no man should have been able to walk. He is in what you feel when you finally realize that you are just a tiny speck in this immensity that stretches beyond what the eye can see." This perspective began to influence a new generation of researchers, both scientists and explorers. They began to seriously consider that perhaps the Yeti was less a physical creature awaiting discovery and more a manifestation of something that happens when humans confront absolute solitude on a scale that defies comprehension. Psychologists specializing in extreme environments who have studied hundreds of Yeti sighting reports over several decades have noticed fascinating and consistent patterns. The vast majority of sightings occurred after several days or weeks of extreme isolation, when the climbers were physically and mentally at the absolute limit of their endurance. Dr. Michael Harrison, who spent 15 years studying the psychological effects of prolonged high-altitude expeditions, wrote, "There is an altered state of consciousness that consistently emerges when humans are exposed to specific combinations of extreme isolation, altitude that challenges normal physiology, and the visual vastness of the Himalayan landscape. In this state, the boundaries between objective perception and subjective experience become extremely fluid. Today, in the 21st century, the Yeti remains a living and transformative presence in the Himalayas, not only in the stories passed down orally by local people, but in the direct experience of all those who venture to the most extreme and inaccessible altitudes on planet Earth. Modern mountaineers, equipped with military-grade GPS, real-time satellite communications, survival gear developed for space exploration, and decades of accumulated scientific knowledge about altitude medicine still report encounters that defy all conventional explanations. A Brazilian mountaineer named Ana Rodrigues recounted an experience in 2019 that perfectly exemplifies this contemporary reality of the Yeti phenomenon. She was alone on a remote Annapurna glacier over 6,000 meters above sea level when she saw a distinctly bipedal silhouette moving against the snow wall on a near vertical slope approximately 400 meters away. It wasn't exactly what I saw that left a lasting impression on me, she explained months later, still visibly moved by the experience. It was what I felt at the moment of the sighting, a solitude so complete, so perfect, so sacred, that it felt like I was witnessing something not meant for human eyes. As if for a moment, I had glimpsed a way of existing that transcends everything we consider possible. Tourism in the region has embraced the Yeti in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. Hotels in Kathmandu display giant fiberglass footprints on their walls. Souvenir shops sell everything from Yeti t-shirts to elaborate sculptures by local artisans. Tour agencies offer Yeti search expeditions that promise authentic adventure with modern comforts. But true mountain connoisseurs, both locals and seasoned visitors, know that this superficial commercialization only scratches the surface of something much deeper and more meaningful. For those who truly know the mountains, the commercial Yeti is almost a shield for the real Yeti. For new generations of Sherpas, Tibetans, and other Himalayan peoples, the Yeti remains exactly what it always was, a powerful representation of the ability to exist in perfect harmony with the most extreme solitude. In an age of constant global connectivity, incessant informational noise, and endless sensory stimuli, this ability becomes not only precious, but essential to human sanity. Tenzin Norbu, a 28-year-old Sherpa who works as a high-altitude guide, explained, "My grandfather taught me that the Yeti isn't something you look for. It's something you find when you're finally alone with yourself in the most complete silence on earth. It's when you stop running from loneliness and start dancing with it." Scientific expeditions continue to occur regularly, but with a fundamentally different approach than those of the last century. Rather than seeking to capture or physically prove the Yeti, many contemporary researchers study the cultural, psychological, and even neurological phenomenon it represents. They want to understand why the idea of the Yeti continues to exert such a magnetic power over the human imagination. Why it continues to transform people who didn't even believe in it before traveling to the Himalayas. Why atheist mountaineers return speaking of spiritual experiences. Why scientific skeptics are beginning to question the boundaries between objectivity and subjectivity. What these researchers are discovering is deeply fascinating. The Yeti appears to function as a kind of catalyst for a fundamental human experience. Our encounter with extreme loneliness combined with our own insignificance in the face of the natural immensity that precedes us and will come after us. Neuropsychologists studying people who spent extended periods in isolation at the most extreme altitudes of the Himalayas discovered measurable changes in brain activity. Areas related to what we call the ego, or individual sense of identity, become significantly less active. Simultaneously, areas related to the perception of connection with the surrounding environment become dramatically more active. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who conducted a 5-year longitudinal study of mountaineers who spent at least a month in isolation above 5,000 meters, found it's as if in conditions of extreme isolation and altitude, the human brain begins to expand beyond the usual boundaries of what we consider self. The boundaries between observer and observed begin to dissolve in ways we can scientifically measure. And since we're talking about presences that can't easily be captured by our usual understanding, I want to extend a very special invitation. There's an extraordinary book called The Forgotten Agreement, The 30-Day Challenge, and in one of its most moving and transformative chapters, It explores precisely the invisible commitments that sustain us in life. Like the Yeti, there are forces in our everyday experience that cannot be seen, photographed or analyzed in a laboratory, but which nevertheless exert a profound and transformative influence on our lives. They are the silent commitments we make to ourselves in our loneliest hours. They are the promises we whisper to the universe when we think no one is listening. They are the secret and sacred agreements we make with our own souls. The Yeti teaches us a fundamental truth. Not everything that is real needs to be tangible. Not everything that transforms us needs to be completely understood by the rational mind. Sometimes, the most powerful and lasting commitments are precisely those that live on the mysterious border between the visible and the invisible, between the probable and the possible, between what we know and what we feel. The Forgotten Agreement explores with depth and sensitivity precisely those territories of human experience where true and lasting transformation truly occurs. Like the Yeti eternally trekking through the unattainable heights of the Himalayas, our deepest and most meaningful promises often exist in places our rational mind can barely reach, but which our soul immediately recognizes. If the ancient story of the Yeti touched something real and deep within you, if you felt that inexplicable but undeniable connection to the mystery that lives beyond conventional explanations, then this book may very well be the next natural step in your own personal journey of discovery and transformation. The link is in the first pinned comment, because just as the Himalayas keep their most precious secrets at the most extreme and inaccessible altitudes, we also keep our most valuable treasures in places that only the courage to explore the unknown territory of ourselves can reach. And here we come to the true, beating heart of the Yeti legend. This isn't just a story about a mysterious creature trekking through the world's highest, most inaccessible mountains. This is a deeply human story about something we all know intimately: the pain of loneliness amidst immensity, and how this seemingly unbearable pain can transform into an unexpected source of strength, wisdom, and connection. Consider for a moment the archetypal image of the Yeti, a fundamentally solitary creature, eternally walking at altitudes where no other being can survive for more than a few hours. He consciously chose the most extreme solitude possible in one of the most hostile and challenging environments our planet offers. And yet, far from being destroyed by this solitude, he not only survives, but becomes legendary, memorable, a presence that echoes through the centuries. How many times in life do we feel exactly like this? Alone in an emotional immensity that seems impossible to traverse. Surrounded by a world that continues to spin in its predictable routine, yet feeling like we're treading an emotional height where no one else can reach us, where the air is too thin for anyone else to breathe with us. The pain of loneliness amidst immensity is one of the most universal and simultaneously isolating human experiences. It's that devastating sensation of being surrounded by billions of people, yet still feeling a piercing emptiness, an insurmountable distance between you and the rest of humanity. It's as if you're the only inhabitant of an emotional mountain where the air is too thin, where the temperature is too hostile for anyone else to survive. But the Yeti offers us a revolutionary lesson about this seemingly destructive experience. He shows us through his own legendary existence that solitude need not be synonymous with abandonment, that existing outside of ordinary experience does not mean existing without purpose or meaning. Even isolated at the most extreme and seemingly deadly altitudes, he continues to be remembered, respected, sought after, and venerated. His strength doesn't come from companionship or external validation. His strength comes from his own essence, from his extraordinary ability to find completeness and even a form of ecstasy, even when everything around him seems empty, hostile, and impossible. The Yeti managed to transform his extreme solitude into a form of communion with something infinitely greater than any conventional human relationship could ever offer. Perhaps this is the most profound and transformative lesson we can learn from this ancient legend. Even when we feel as if we are walking alone in an endless, icy expanse, even when it seems no one in the world can comprehend the extreme emotional heights at which we live, we are not truly abandoned or lost. Immensity is not a sign of emptiness or absence. Immensity is a sign that there is an infinite space waiting to be filled by our unique and unrepeatable presence. Like the Yeti, who transformed the most hostile and seemingly dead mountains on the planet into his sacred home, we too can learn to transform our deepest solitude into a unique and powerful way of existing in the world. There is something profoundly sacred in those who can find peace and even joy in the most extreme solitude, not because they reject human connection or consider themselves superior to others, but because they have discovered through direct experience that there are types of connection, types of communion, types of love that can only be experienced when we have the extraordinary courage to walk alone at the most challenging heights of human experience. The Yeti lives eternally on the border between the real and the mythical, because that is precisely where the most important truths about the human condition reside, on the mysterious border between solitude and the deepest communion, between apparent isolation and the most intense presence, between feeling completely alone in the universe and realizing that we are an inseparable part of something immensely greater than our individual understanding. How many transformed people have returned from the Himalayas, not because they finally encountered the physical Yeti, but because their sincere search for him led them to find something far more valuable within themselves: the ability to exist at peace with their own solitude. The courage to tread the most extreme and seemingly dangerous emotional heights without losing the fundamental connection with the sacred that exists in every authentic human experience. Perhaps we all carry a bit of the Yeti within us. Perhaps we all need, at some crucial point in life, to learn to walk alone on our own highest and most challenging inner mountains. Not because we are rejected by the world, or because we reject the world, but because there is a form of wisdom, a form of strength, a form of love that can only be discovered at these extreme heights of human experience. The next time you feel alone in a seemingly impossible expanse, remember the legend of the Yeti. Remember that there's a fundamental difference between being alone due to external circumstances and choosing to be in sacred solitude. Remember that even at the most extreme and seemingly hostile altitudes of human experience, it's possible not only to survive, but to discover a unique, powerful, and transformative way of existing. Because just as the Yeti continues to walk eternally through the highest mountains in the world, leaving only mysterious footprints that soon disappear in the snow, but remaining alive and present in the memory and heart of all who dare to look for him, we too can leave our mark on the world in ways that go far beyond the visible and the measurable. Our solitude can become our greatest source of strength. Our seemingly empty expanse can become our most sacred home, and our solitary journey up life's most challenging mountains can become the very reason others find the courage to make their own seemingly impossible climbs. If this ancient legend of the Yeti touched something real and deep in your heart, if you recognized in its timeless story something of your own journey through the most extreme heights of human experience, then I have a very special invitation for you. Subscribe to the channel here and turn on the notification bell. Because there are many other ancient stories walking silently among us, many other legends that hold precious secrets about how to transform our apparent loneliness into real wisdom, our pain into a source of strength, our quest into transformative discovery. Stories of dragons who discovered that their true strength lay precisely in what made them different from all other beings. Tales of mermaids who understood that belonging simultaneously to two completely different worlds was actually a rare gift, not a curse to be endured. Legends of phoenixes who learned that consciously rising from their own ashes is the most beautiful and powerful way to honor all we once were while becoming all we can still be. Each of these ancient stories is a secret trail to the highest mountains of the human soul. And I, Kaya, will be here to walk with you along each of these mysterious paths, discovering together the treasures our ancestors carefully hidden at the highest altitudes of human wisdom, accumulated through millennia of experience. Because just as the Yeti continues to walk eternally through the Himalayan mountains, always present but always one step ahead of us, always inviting us to climb a little higher, to dare to take another courageous step towards the unknown, these ancient stories remain alive and pulsating, patiently waiting for those brave enough to seek them out. See you in the next legend. And always remember, even when you feel completely alone in the most challenging immensity, you are never truly alone. There are footprints in the snow of human experience showing that many others have traversed similar territories before you, and that you too will leave your own unique footprints for those brave enough to come after you. Until the next journey through the eternal mountains of ancient legends.